With that being said, in fields like engineering, students and professionals are expected to recognize their ethical responsibility to numerous stakeholders who come from a variety of contexts. Inside and outside of engineering, researchers encounter similar expectations surrounding the need for ethical work. So this talk, as part of the Research Integrity Week seminar hosted by the Graduate School, will focus on aspects of ethical engineering practices as it relates to classrooms, cultures, and communities. So without any further ado, we'd like to welcome Dr. Long. He will speak until around a quarter till the end of the hour, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and answers from the audience. Welcome, Dr. Long.
Good morning to everyone. Thanks for having me. I see a few familiar names and faces, so I appreciate the support. I do think it's a blessing to just even be, able to be on this platform, use this technology, and to even be in a state like Florida right now. I know a lot of family and friends up north, they're battling a pretty severe winter storm. So yeah, fortunate to be able to, communicate through this platform. All right, so we already mentioned the title of the talk, Contextualizing Engineering Ethics, Classrooms, Cultures, and Communities. Already introduced me, Dr. Leroy Long III. I am an associate professor with tenure of engineering. Again, I do have a PhD, master's, bachelor's degree as well, PhD being in STEM education, bachelor's and master's in mechanical, just in case you missed that or joined late. And then I did want to make note that I do have my own education-based company to show that part of what I'm going to say today is that the work that I do, the passion that I have, it doesn't start and stop with an employer, it doesn't start and stop with an institution, but it's something that I do throughout my life, inside and outside of academia. So many times when we're doing research, we're always thinking, well, why is this research necessary, right? So normally we're addressing some problem, we're trying to solve some issue. And so the reason I decided to, undertake this work, and really the reason ethics matters to me, there are numerous points, right? And so one of them, when I think back on when I first learned about ethics, for me, I think it started in elementary school, at least what I would define as anything related to engineering ethics. And it was just doing, science projects for class, participating in the science fair. And I remember they said there was this process you need to follow if you were doing science or doing engineering in an ethical manner, right? You're posing this question, you have ways you gather the information, you come up with a hypothesis, you test it, and then you share the results, right? And you want to be transparent with the way you share it. So I remember this, and that was probably the first instance I can think of anything related to, research integrity, to ethics, or to engineering. Right. And then as I got older and I went to college, and we mentioned that I have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, I remember hearing about this thing called ABET and this National Society of Professional Engineers and even the National Academy of Engineering. But it started to just confuse me because I don't remember, and it could be because I'm getting older, even though I look fairly young for my age. I can't recall a specific class, a specific curriculum that I encounter in undergrad on ethics. So I'm getting all of this language, all these competing interests, trying to make sense of it from my origins with the science fair and the scientific method. How does this all come together? And then I actually go into industry. So the summer after I finished my first year of college, I had an internship with Toyota in Kentucky. And I remember there, they were talking about conflicts of interest and ethics there. And part of the ethics was, receiving gifts. And that's the picture you see there with a person with their hand up. So they were saying that someone who's a contractor could provide maybe snacks for the office, the entire office, but they should not be targeting me with gifts. And even prior to that, one thing I remember encountering is when I was walking into the facility, there's this large fence, and on it, it says you're entering this foreign trade zone. And I'm like, oh no, what does that mean? I don't know anything about a foreign trade zone. Can I get thrown in jail for just doing my job? Is there some secrets I need to keep to myself? Can I even tell anyone I do this work? And so I'm saying all of that to tell you that for undergraduate and graduate students, it can be confusing. All right, engineering ethics isn't always clear. It isn't always straightforward. You're encountering it in different contexts, at different age levels. And then we haven't even discussed what we bring to the table personally. Right. And so the bottom, you see someone covering their face, because I think many times, whether it's due to insecurity or whether it's due to oppression, we feel like we can't show who we truly are. We can't even look ourselves in the mirror when we're doing this work. And then certainly ethics and morality tend to come up in sometimes debates or overlapping ways. And so we don't just turn off the fact that we have certain belief systems, whether that's beliefs due to faith or other things that have informed who we are and the way we go about life. And so I just wanted to start with that. And what I'll say in this talk is I'm not going to give you some in-depth overview of engineering ethics research. I'm not going to go over all the studies you can find on Google Scholar or peer through ASEE. I'm just going to speak to my lived experience as it relates to this and hopefully find ways that we can connect. All right. And so right now, I just want you to personally reflect. So when did you first think about or get exposed to anything related to engineering, anything related to ethics, or anything related to research integrity? And as you're thinking back on that, if there's some definition that comes up, if there's just the name of an event like the science fair, if there's a class, you can feel free to drop anything that comes to mind, you know, just a couple words. So for me, I mentioned science fair. I mentioned internship or co-op at Toyota. I mentioned different organizations, you know, ABET, NSPE, NAE, you know, so when did you get introduced to these topics? What do they mean to you? I cannot see the chat right now, but certainly someone could report out for me just so I don't have to end or step out of the slides.
Sure. So I started the comments off. Mine was in my senior year of undergraduate study in engineering. Dr. Stephen Sekiel says fundamentals of engineering exam. He didn't think about it. Didn't think a lot more about it until a CITI training was required as a PhD.
Okay. And those are really good points because we do have a lot of students who will either encounter it as first year engineering undergrads or senior year during senior design, but nothing in between. But they're expected to know it as they're maybe working in industry. And then I think what Dr. Stephen said is also helpful because I took the FE exam. I forgot to mention that. I did take it before graduating undergrad. And I remember some of the, you know, level of uncertainty with those topics, given the fact that it was a multi-hour exam. So any other examples?
So Dr.
Yeah,
Strong.
so, yeah.
Go ahead, Collins, please.
Yeah, so mine was my first year in graduate school. I took a class on computer and electrical engineering research. So in that class, we talk a little bit about ethics. And it was because we're doing a course in cybersecurity. So we talk about, ethical issues in cybersecurity.
And that's certainly concerning, right? You made it all the way through undergrad, you have a degree, you know, you could have gone straight into industry at that point. Then you go to graduate school and now you're finally, you know, learning about ethics, at least in a specific class. It looks like Nicholas has his hand up.
Yeah, in my case, that was interesting. So we had an undergraduate seminar in my curriculum of chemical engineering. So we only had one day where we had some people from industry that came to talk about, you know, some disasters that happened in the chemical industry, and that was due to ethical reasons. So that was like a half a day on ethics.
And so I think it's important that we are honest with ourselves, one, in reflecting back on our time as students, and then honest if we are in a role as a leader, whether that's a graduate teaching assistant, an undergraduate teaching assistant, a faculty member. So where have we and have we not been exposed, and how does that reflect upon how we go about things now in our current roles?
So one of our graduate students said when working for a software engineer in an IT company, there was a requirement to sign some confidentiality statements to protect the privacy of customer information. She mentions our client was a US-based insurance company. So just mentioning that as well. And I know, feel free to just call, you know, Dr. Strong whenever you respond to that last comment.
Yeah, so last comment reminds me of my experience, which was pretty daunting. I was, I think 18 years old, you know, working for this top tier global company. Toyota was number 2 at the time, but has since emerged as a top automotive entity. And then I knew they were owned by, you know, it was a Japanese owned company. So it was just really scary. I don't feel like I had, you know, a strong basis for ethics. And then I'm in a foreign trade zone. I'm being told about conflicts of interest. So I can fully relate to that experience of learning or being exposed to it in industry. And then Dr. Strong, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing all these different examples. The first thing though that for me that came to mind, so I was an aerospace engineering major, is tragedy. Like every time I was introduced to ethics in aerospace, we were introduced to it multiple times because we couldn't leave. Exactly, like we could not ignore what had happened in our past. as we did the design work, because so much of the aerospace program was tied to congressional ethics. Like anytime there was an accident, the funding was on the line and all these pieces. So I just found that as an interesting thing that came to mind right when you said the question.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's like a perfect transition point for me. So, I mean, we are exposed to ethics in a number of contexts as we've all reflected upon, right? Whether that was in a classroom, undergrad, graduate level, in industry, co-op, internship, full-time employment, maybe just even in our personal lives. Because if you're in Florida, of course, if you're into NASA or space, you're going to be in the news cycle and seeing what's going on with these various entities. But I do remember that when I started to get exposed to it in the classroom, it was really as a graduate teaching assistant. And so we were trying to develop curriculum at the same time or close to the same time that I published this paper. And one of the examples, as Dr. Strong mentioned, that we used was, Challenger, Columbia. And it's just unfortunate because you're learning about these people. Ronald McNair, he's such an impactful person, has programs at campuses all across the country. I looked online and saw you all even have one for matriculating Black students of color, those from disadvantaged backgrounds, up into faculty ranks, doing what we're doing, getting exposed to research. But yeah, he passed away. The first, Indian woman, and I cannot think of her name right now, so I do apologize. I'm not trying to offend anyone, but she was on, one of those tragic incidents. So you're celebrating people and what they're able to do. You're trying to come up with these diverse pools of candidates, and yet due to unforeseen, incidents, tragedy strikes, as Dr. Strong said. So then ethics can become this depressing topic, right? We were also exposed to like the Minnesota bridge collapse, being in the Midwest at Ohio State. So yeah, all this tragedy. Of course, you all even had a bridge collapse close to your campus, in recent years. So again, tragedy, a downer. But I want to get to a point where we can, pay honor to these individuals, certainly celebrate their lives, but hopefully make ethics something more positive and something we can get excited about as well. And so I'll just start with this paper, just so I'm honest with my exposure as a researcher. And so the first time I did ethics as a researcher was in my graduate studies. I believe it was my first or second year of my PhD program. And I was fortunate that we did this for an ASEE regional conference and won best student paper. So that's another reason I wanted to bring it up. But we were looking at value development. We realized that students' value development actually increases when they have positive relationships with other students and faculty. And so it is important for us to create opportunities for collaboration. And that's going to get into kind of a methodological approach that I'll talk about as well. But how can we get students and faculty to collaborate, to communicate, to make ethics, again, something that grows over time? And hopefully it's sustained. It's not just hit the first year, the last year, and that's it. But I won't go into a lot of details. One thing I will say there in terms of just being honest and upfront, we did mention that in this study, and I've done others, my master's thesis, my PhD, my dissertation, where we had small samples of people of color, right? Not necessarily the sample size we want of women, but we mentioned that in our limitations. And I think that's part of research integrity. We did not get positionality statements. I did not know about them at the time, so I'll be honest about that. Never heard about a positionality statement when I was in early years of graduate school, and certainly not for quantitative studies, which this one was. So again, just being honest about my own shortcomings so that hopefully you can relate and we can start to challenge it. But I do think if I were to undertake another quantitative study now, I would certainly put a positionality statement in that paper. I would certainly continue to talk about limitations, about sample, because I remember even being embarrassed when I was first doing my dissertation study and I wanted to talk about people of color. I'm like, Ohio State doesn't have the numbers that I want at this time. And I'm not trying to speak negatively against my graduate institution. I'm just being honest with you. They did not have the numbers that I wanted. It was not an FIU, a minority serving institution, right? So that was not the case. So that was kind of ethics in the classroom for me. Again, I want to honor Dr. Ronald McNair and others who passed away in tragedies, but hopefully we can get to a point where we can see ethics as a positive as well, and not some topic we want to avoid because it just makes us sad and depressed. All right. And so when it comes to cultures and communities, I tend to see it as a more positive, just because I understand that through work with the United Nations, we can bring people together across the globe doing this work. So although you see topics like poverty and hunger, I get more excited when I see the potential for solutions, when I see the potential for us coming together and for this international call to do it. It's not just me being concerned, It's not just ABET, it's not just NSPE, it's not you all, but there's a international effort to solve crises and issues that we're facing, right? But the key is that we need to do that in a culturally sensitive way, right? That is the key. And we need to start to uncover. So instead of always looking in the mirror with our eyes and hands covered, how can we start to truly see ourselves for who we are and be transparent about it? How can we see, the intersecting ways that our morality, comes into play when we talk about ethics? Because again, I don't turn off the fact that I'm a Christian and doing this work, but I can be aware of it and the biases that may be present. All right, so I won't go into great detail there, but I did just want to, again, make sure we're aware that ethics is taking place in various contexts. The classroom, I didn't see it necessarily as an undergrad, or I can't remember it. Graduate school as a TA and as a researcher, and then seeing this international call for being ethical as we relate and do work with various cultures and communities. All right, so I just want to have that in the back of our minds. And so how do we begin to connect these topics? So if we're learning about ethics only in the classroom, or we're learning about ethics only in industry, how do we connect it to being researchers? And how do we do that in a way that is deemed integral, right? And a way of being someone who is upstanding, transparent, honest, straightforward, all the things that you would see in those calls. So the way that I've gone about it, and this is only me, I can only speak to my lived experience, I had to first self-reflect. So again, I showed the picture of the mirror, hands above the eyes. I never heard about a positionality statement. I was blind to it. But then if I'm being honest with myself, I also didn't want to acknowledge certain things. And so even amongst other Black people, I'm middle class, that could be perceived as a level of advantage, right? Again, being a Christian, that can be perceived as a level of advantage. Being heterosexual, that can be perceived as a level of advantage. Being of lighter complexion, that can be perceived as a level of advantage, even within my own culture, even within my own community. Being a second generation college student, being, I believe, a third generation homeowner, right? These things create advantage. So it's difficult sometimes for us to personally reflect and to honor who we are and how we come about this work. But I'll say for me, and I'm actually working on my third one, I found it helpful to do what we call collaborative autoethnographic work. And so the reason I think it's helpful is because it forces us to self-reflect in a public way, right? A very public way. You get credit and honor recognition for it potentially through the form of a publication, but it allows you to also share power. And so the picture in the bottom middle is one of my former research assistants, McKenna James, who since has been working on a master's degree, working in industry at an aerospace company. But I was able to share power with her. So rather than me, quote unquote, studying her or her peers, she is not only the research participant, but she is the researcher with me. All right. And so we are up here. You can argue shared power. Now, some people still might say I'm the first author, I'm her research advisor. So it's not fully equal, but I tried my best to share power with her. And I'll even admit that at times McKenna challenged me because I mentioned my exposure to STEM or engineering being in the summer program and the fact that I stopped playing sports, through my school or just enrichment programs I had to high school. And McKenna challenged me and said, yes, that's because you had that scholarship. Many of us, speaking from her own perspective as student athletes, she was saying we compete to have our college paid for. You no longer needed to do that. All right. So you have to honor that. And it was helpful for me. McKenna and I also challenge each other in terms of race and gender. I'm in a male dominated field as a man. She's a woman, but she's white. She's in a white dominated field. And so there are times in which we both had advantages or disadvantages. All right. But the key there is that we formed a mentoring relationship, which still exists in some regard to this day. All right. And McKenna's goal is to become a faculty member. So I gave her a publication as a recent undergrad, right, which hopefully can propel her into the role of a faculty member. All right. But the odd thing is the first paper I did in this forum was actually to the right. And it was actually with a guy I went to graduate school with, Dr. Chris Travers, but it wasn't published first. So we actually did it. It was a slow process with the Journal of Negro Education. I think we started in maybe 2017, like a year into my role as a faculty member. It didn't come out until last year. We submitted it 2018. So it took about 3 years, 2 to 3 years for it to come out. But it was the first one I actually did. And I give credit to Dr. Travers for making me think of this process and the benefits that come along with it. And I'll also say, since it's Black History Month, I gave recognition to Ronald McNair, that part of the reason I was interested is because I knew that the Journal of Negro Education, when I looked into it, had papers published by Thurgood Marshall, right? First Black person and man to be on the Supreme Court, right? W.B. Du Bois, noted scholar. He talks about double consciousness, which Black people deal with and come out. This type of research where you're in this oppressive system, but you're trying to stay true to your culture and identity. His paper, I know specifically in the Journal of Negro Education, talked about whether separate schools were necessary. You have Ralph Bunchy, who actually helped form the United Nations, which I talked about earlier. First African-American Black person to win the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Dorothy Heights, integral for talking about the intersection between race and gender, right, in the civil rights movement. And so this really made me feel good. And to be honest, the paper I'm most proud of is the Brotherly Bond piece, because it's in the Journal of Negro Education with these scholars I admired for years. And I wrote it with Dr. Travers, and we were honest about wanting to become faculty members at one point in time, but prior to that, not knowing anything about it, right? But through us challenging each other, we were able to bring out different points in our process that inspired us. And so we just felt like this is an ethical approach. The people I cited there under the methods, ABS or ABES, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, so I'll be honest there. The researcher of that paper talks about the fact that we can research in borderlands. So we can be critical, we can be collaborative, we can be autoethnographic, we can use a constructivist lens. There's not one way to go about this. It's good if we overlap different approaches or strategies. Chang and all, what they talk about is a step-by-step way in which we do it. And part of that is things I mentioned before with McKenna. So we're sharing power, right? We're challenging each other. So it's more factual now because it's not just me recalling these events, but someone else is recalling them with me, right? And offering it from different perspectives or vantage points. So I would just encourage you to look more into either one of those publications. And again, I am working on a third one. Hopefully that one will come out in the next year or two. But, I think it's very helpful to start with yourself and then to collaborate with others and then to situate yourself in the larger body of research, which we certainly did. So any questions at this point? So any questions about collaborative autoethnographic work, about my time as a graduate student or as a faculty member? Well, oddly, although I started by talking about these publications, when I go about research these days, and I did do it with each of those publications, I first start with my own positionality. So although I have the published work, the typical approach is you have like an abstract introduction, maybe purpose, you're getting into your methods later. I actually start with the methods and I start with my own positionality. So I sit there and think, who am I in context of this study? And so McKenna, that paper, I'm talking more about my exposure to playing sports and my family doing that. With the paper with Chris, and I did rearrange them here just because, again, I wrote the paper with Chris first and then the paper with McKenna. The paper with Chris more is what type of work do I do as a faculty member, right? How does that inform this study that I'm doing? Because a lot of my work did focus on Black men. So not only am I a Black man, is my co-author a Black man, but we do work on Black men, right? So just being honest about, again, who I am, where I come from, and how that informs the work that I'm doing. In terms of the citation I list there, Rich Milner, what he talks about is being honest and recognizing that race and culture do intersect with our positionality. And so there's some people who would say, especially in this current era, we shouldn't talk about critical race theory, right? We shouldn't talk about race at all. We should just be colorblind. We should be gender blind to many other, identity markers of who we are and how we come about this work. But I agree with Milner's work and his position that we do need to be transparent. All of us, quantitative work, qualitative work, mixed methods, whatever the case might be, we should be transparent and open about it. And that was very helpful for me. And I think what I've learned through the process, right, is when I think of who I am first, it allows me to be more empathetic to my research population. And then what Milner talks about is when you're more empathetic and understanding, you can recognize potential dangers. So I also, be transparent that I previously did work dealing with resilience in terms of Black students, all right? But I did not understand, because I hadn't taken enough time to think back on who my audience would be. So I thought about myself, I thought about my research population, but I didn't really think that the majority of engineering education scholars are white. The majority are even white women. And so could they really understand what I'm saying about Black men and their positionality? There's going to be a gender difference and a race difference. And I wasn't sensitive to my audience's needs in presenting that data. I assumed that they would understand, they would get it, that, you know, we're thinking anti-deficit. These students are coming in, they're confident, they're resilient, not what's wrong with them, how can we fix them, you know, things that I didn't really want to take place or to happen. And so I would just argue and recommend that it's very helpful to, again, use collaborative autoethnographic, you know, methods or approaches to recognize your own positionality, not just as a researcher, but think about that in the context of your research population. Think about the context of the audiences that you're going to introduce and share this work with, right? And so I just think it's really helpful. We started to do it in the beginning in terms of ethics, but in terms of specific projects, we need to carry that out. And I do want to form a linkage. And so early on, you know, I mentioned the classroom, but I've gotten to a point where I've only talked about research because I went to this publication and then 2 others, right? But even when we're teaching, our positionality is important. A graduate class that I took, 1 to be a teaching assistant, and 2, which introduced me to the field of engineering education, talked about us teaching who we are. So I would argue not only when undertaking a research study, but when going into the classroom, we need to do this exact same process. Who I am, how does this inform me teaching statics, right? Who I am, how does this inform me teaching something about, you know, the environment? Because I come from a place in which, you know, I feel like my communities are being polluted. And they've been victim to things like the highway system in the US, which disperse affluent Black communities, prosperous communities. And now the highways run through those communities, or what's left of them, and pollutes them, you know? So that's something I'll have to be honest about. You know, if it was even dealt with statics, I don't have a civil engineering background, I have a mechanical engineering background. I have not worked for a civil engineering company, but I have some idea. And I still to this day have a little bit of bad taste in my mouth due to an early bridge building competition, in which, being the only Black member of that team, I was given the bridge last, right? So all of that informs the work I'm doing, the way I form teams in terms of their group work, and I have to be honest and transparent about that. All right, so any questions at this point about methods I've undertaken, the way I've gone about positionality statements?
Well, not a question, Dr. Long. Just wanted to say that several of our PhD students are with us today, and they have been engaging in the work of positionality statements. So I think you're saying this is very timely. I don't want to speak for them, but it is timely.
And again, that is the first step in my process. So I do not start with an abstract or introduction. I don't even necessarily think of a problem statement. It's self-reflection. So who am I? Who am I serving in terms of my research population? And then who am I going to share that information with? Those are the 3 steps I typically take. And I do want to continue to advocate, as Milner does, for us being honest and upfront about how race impacts our positionality and the positionality of the research participants, positionality of the audience, how gender impacts it, and many other identity markers, right? Being upfront, open, and honest, and not being scared or timid because there are politicians and people not informed, you know, with these studies at the level that we are. They are not experts on critical race theory. They are not experts on engineering education. They are not experts on even ethics, right? We cannot let those things deter us from being open and honest about who we are and trying to protect those that we, you know, are in positions of power to serve. So if there are any questions there, I'll move on to impact. And this was actually funny to me when I first got to this, you know, slide, because I hadn't really looked. I think at the publications I had done recently, I certainly sometime when I go by default, it does cited by. And so I see those at the top. One is my master's thesis work. Another one is academic and social barriers for Black and Latino men. But the 2 papers I talked about today, they currently have 0 citations. Now, part of that may be because I published during COVID, right? Part of that may be because it's only been a little over a year or 2 that these were out there. Part of it could be because I haven't done a good job, you know, of making sure the work is recognized. But it also helped me recognize and realize that my definition of impact is different than what Google Scholar might say. It's different than maybe what a promotion and tenure committee may say. And I have tenure. For me, impact was the actual programs themselves that I talk about in these papers. And so the one with Chris is about the Bell Fellows program from The Ohio State University. I show a picture of Dr. James Moore there because at the time he was heading the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And then at the bottom left corner, I show Dr. Robert Bennett, who was the chief or head staff member assisting Dr. Moore with that work. But to date, almost 50 scholars, primarily Black scholars or other students of color, have gone through that program and have become faculty members. And so regardless of how many citations I have, again, nearly 50 people have been positively impacted by the program. Myself included, my co-author, Dr. Chris Travers included. All right, so I don't need a citation to know that that work was impactful. All right, I don't. Me even publishing in the Journal of Negro Education with the elite scholars I mentioned before, right? Thurgood Marshall, W.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunchy, Dorothy Heights. I don't need a citation, right? Now, certainly it can help. If you're working on a dissertation, you can cite me if you want. You're working on a research paper, you can cite me if you want. But that's something that is helpful. It's just not to get deterred by metrics that may be completely outside of our control. The paper with McKenna. And so I have McKenna here in the second row on the left-hand side, but I have graduated 12 undergraduate students. About half of them have pursued master's degrees or graduate degrees. One is a current PhD student, Claudia. And so I've had impact in the research team that I was able to form with McKenna, which we discussed in that paper, and even the number of student athletes I've been able to mentor. So true impact, regardless of a citation count, regardless of me getting an award. I haven't received an award for either one of these papers the way I did for the first one I mentioned, right? With Dr. Stephen Williams. So Michael Stephen Williams and Dr. Strayhorn. Not received an award, as I did for did for that one. I've not received it here. So if I got deterred by awards, by citation counts, right, I wouldn't do this work. But in terms of my research integrity, in terms of my ethics, I believe that these programs are worth replicating. I believe that I should shine a positive light or a lens on what's being done. And then I put it in the hands of people like you, people higher than you in positions of power, to actually do something with it, right? All I can do is share my truth. All I can do is share my story. I can't force them to cite it. I can't force them to replicate it, all right? So just being reflective there in terms of impact. So any questions at this point about methods, positionality, or potential impact? I do want to say a few more points here, but just any points at this or any questions at this point in time before I introduce those additional points? All right, well, I'll start with the Brotherly Bond paper in terms of impact. And so I mentioned the classroom and then different cultures and community. So in the literature review, and I'm not going to tell you everything in the paper because I do hope some people will read it, we talk about the fact that we were the first in our families to accomplish many things. First to get PhDs or terminal degree, right? First to potentially even go to graduate school. I'm the first engineer of any kind that I'm aware of, first educator of any kind. And so the work that I'm publishing has an impact much broader than even the engineering community, much broader than even the academic community, because the Bell Fellows program propelling me up to this level has allowed me to be, someone who's making history during this month that we recognize, right? I am Black history. Dr. Chris Travers is Black history. Dr. Robert Bennett is Black history. Dr. James Moore III is Black history. And so again, much broader impact than what we can see through our publications or some of the metrics that we claim to value, right? And that's just from a community standpoint. When I go out and I speak to people, I can tell you, right? One, I joke that I'm kind of like the Steph Curry of academia, given my youthful appearance or baby face, but the amount of people I'm able to inspire, right, through my accomplishments, the amount of people I'm able to help with the resources I have, right? These are much bigger impacts than anything you can see with a citation count or with an award that's being offered through ASEE, NSF, any of the organizations that we typically rely on. Right? So I just want to keep us there. And then in terms of McKenna, one thing I wanted to say, and I know things have started to change with NIL, if you're not aware of it, name, image, and likeness. Student athletes are starting to receive some of the things that they've worked really hard for in terms of labor and energy. They're being compensated for it, not just at their institutions with a potential scholarship, but off campus with endorsement deals and things that like. But prior to that, again, I was mentoring McKenna and various other students on my team, and I was paying them to do the work. So I was giving them additional forms of compensation, because a lot of people who haven't done work or haven't been a student athlete don't realize that their contracts, quote unquote, or their scholarships are renewable annually. They're not guaranteed. So you could be recruited to an institution and you don't perform well, you get injured, they could pull that scholarship from you. So it is important to give students other experiences outside of their sport, whether that's research, whether that's teaching or internship. It is very helpful. And then even the financial burden. There are many student athletes who are not on full scholarships, despite stereotypes and examples that we may see of men's football, men's basketball, women's basketball. Many student athletes are not paid with full scholarships. They need additional forms of compensation. They need various experiences to boost confidence, or to give them the credentials that will help them land a full-time position in industry or in graduate school. So again, much broader impact than anything that can be noted on Google Scholar, than anything that can be said through an award. And so I just wanted to bring that up as we're talking about ethics and integrity. You have to think, what do you value? Do those values always align with your profession? Do they always align with your institution? And if not, and if you're not getting public recognition, are you still willing to do the work? Are you willing to do the work regardless? That could have a positive impact in the classroom, in your community, or with various cultures, even without the recognition coming behind it. All right. And that's something I've struggled with. It is difficult. It is difficult at times. I don't want to pretend that it's easy. It is difficult to put in so much time and energy and to see 0 citations. It's difficult to put in time and energy and to never feel like you're getting recognized. You don't win the award for most service. You don't win the Researcher of the Year award. You don't win the Teacher of the Year award. But I do the work anyway. And again, I do it inside and outside of work. At a university and with my own company, I'm doing the work. I've even put in paperwork to start a nonprofit. So something I'm trying to do holistically. All right. And so you may be thinking, I've talked about, the challenge, when and how, if ever, do we hear about ethics? Are we getting confused by these different definitions from ABET, NSPE, from industry, from a professor, right? We can potentially go about it in various ways of research using CAE, positionality statements, rising above any hardcore metrics of impact. But what would I recommend? What would I tell you all to do, given all the things I've shared so far? All right, and so one, I'll start with the classroom. And I do want to give kudos to various higher education scholars, meaning those who are outside of engineering or engineering education, but they're social science researchers, and they've set a foundation that people start to bring into fields like ours, technical fields. And so Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who I believe has since retired, she would be emeritus at this point, but she talked about culturally relevant pedagogy. And so if we're sensitive to different people, we've already reflected on our own positionality, how can we make sure the curriculum we're introducing, even we're talking about the Challenger, that is culturally sensitive? Because I think if you introduce it in Florida or in Houston, maybe even parts of Ohio, Cleveland has NASA facilities, you would need to be extra sensitive there, because people may actually have family members, friends who have worked for these companies, been directly impacted by those tragedies that we mentioned earlier, right? If I'm teaching in Minnesota and I'm talking about the Minnesota bridge collapse, am I being sensitive there, right? If I'm in Florida, am I sensitive to what happened close to your campus with the bridge collapsing, right? If I'm talking about environmental justice, am I sensitive to communities that live close to the highways that have been displaced, all right? All of this is important. Do I provide opportunity for students to see someone like themselves in the class? Do you hire and employ people like me? That is important. That's what she's talking about in terms of this work. And similar to what I did with CAE, is their power being shared? Are students able to, challenge the curriculum, to introduce stories from their own communities, their own lived experience? All of this is helpful in the classroom setting. All right, I'll jump down to the bottom right and talk about Dr. Ebony McGee, because she is a researcher in our field, STEM education. She is an engineer, has worked in industry, done research as an engineer or engineering educator, right? But she talks about the cost. And so when you're Black or you're brown, you know, yes, we can look good on paper. And that goes back to some of those metrics or of potential impact. I got 3 degrees, right? I'm fortunate to say, by the grace of God, I don't have college debt, right? I've been able to be a homeowner, right? All of these things are beneficial. I did not have tuition that I had to pay for undergrad, right? But we still encounter bruises. And so just because you see on paper, it looks great, right? What does it take for me to get to these positions? You know, are we celebrating resilience? Are we being open and honest about what that does to people, right? That resilience is forced on us many times as a mode of survival. It's not something we want to have to do, right? We want to be able to thrive and not just survive. And so I do want to give kudos to Dr. McGee there. I would highly encourage you to read her book and look at her citations on a place like Google Scholar, numerous papers that you could read. She talks about it more from a research standpoint, where Dr. Gloria Lasson-Billings talking about it a little bit more from a teaching standpoint, unless you want to look at work on CRT. But just showing those 2 perspectives. And then the last person I want to talk about, and unfortunately she did pass away recently, is Bell Hooks, who mentions love really as a form of ethics. So like leading with love, thinking about love. And I believe it's something that we don't talk about. We're not honest when we go about teaching or research. And so how do I show my students love? Whether that's students in my class, students I'm mentoring in terms of teaching as a teaching assistant, student researchers, the broader community when I'm sharing work, am I sharing it in a loving way, a way that would create love from others? And I think this is helpful and important because we get to a point sometimes we're really discouraged and beat down, whether it's by COVID, whether it's by the tragedies I mentioned earlier with NASA, based on our own frustrations. You know, I'm not getting cited, I'm not getting promoted, I'm not getting recognized, right? And so just really reflecting on our own experience. What is the leading cause? What is the leading motivation behind this work that we're doing? And for me, I've got to a place of peace because I do just try to do it as a token of love for others. And I hope that's been well received. I think I formed a lot of positive relationships with the students I've mentored, the people I've collaborated with, you know, and I think part of that is due to love. I actually have a motto called lead with love and follow up with justice. So it is something I do. And I also just show you, just to make sure you don't think I'm trying to sell you on work I haven't read or I'm not familiar with. I have both of these books. You know, I've purchased them with my own money. So I would encourage you to do so as well. They're great reads, something you can cite. So it's not just for, you know, leisurely activity. You can actually cite it if you are working on a dissertation or research publication. I think it would be extremely helpful. Right. And I'll just share one more slide and then I'll end. But I think we need to seek, you know, support from funding agencies that will also allow us to do this. So it's one thing to undertake our own research. You know, I mentioned doing that in my master's with the paper that won an award, and then with a research assistant of mine and with a peer, right? But I need to continue, right? Because I can't just shoulder this myself. So can NSF provide me with funds to do it? And fortunately, I do have a current grant collaborating with other, you know, colleagues of mine. And when we created the proposal, one thing I thought about, and it hasn't got to a point where I'm comfortable completely, but do we have representation across gender? Fortunately, we do have a woman. In an ideal world, we would have multiple women, right? Do we have a person of color? Fortunately, I'm on there, so we do have a person of color. Are we from different disciplinary backgrounds? We have social scientists. We have one person who's a staff member, other people who are faculty members. So are different perspectives being brought forward here with this work that we're undertaking, right? And so just being sure that we're carrying this out in all facets of our life as teachers, as researchers, as we're seeking funding, as we're thinking about impact, you know, holistic approach to combining ethics and research integrity. All right. So I'll kind of stop there really with getting you to think about what you can do to help, whether that's just, you know, undertaking a paper, embedding this within your dissertation research, using it as you're going into the classroom as a teacher, doing what I've done, maybe starting a company or business and being a community servant at a higher level. You know, what can you do with what I've shared? All right, so again, I'll stop there and take any questions or comments, but I do appreciate your time and attentiveness. And hopefully that was helpful for the work that you're doing as you're trying to finish up your graduate studies.
We have a question from Nicola.
Thank you, Dr. Long, for the presentation. It really resonated with me. So when you talk about love, you're kind of referring to empathy about, and also how you kind of frame your work about how it can impact others, right?
Yeah, so I think one, I have to be honest again about who I am, the biases I present, but I try not to, get caught up in the lights. And by the lights, again, I mean awards, I even mean funding in terms of awards, promotion and tenure, but about helping others. And so when I did the first one with Dr. Travers, it was really about getting more students of color, more students who are marginalized or minoritized up through the faculty ranks. Right? Because I know that has a trickle down effect. When you have more faculty from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, now students will see themselves. And I've never said this, as I've been talking today, but I never wanted to be a faculty member or thought I would be a faculty member from the sheer fact that I didn't identify with those who were in front of me. So I had, from my memory, all white and Asian men, East Asian, Indian men, never saw a Black person. I don't even recall seeing a woman in any of my engineering classes as a faculty member. They also had a complex or a personality type that I thought was more kind of geeky. And I feel like I've had a more balanced personality, and I'm not saying that in a judgmental view. There's nothing wrong with being a geek or a nerd. I just don't self-identify that way, And so I did not see myself doing what I'm doing today. It did not seem possible to me. I was just going to go work at a place like Toyota, and that would have been it. Right? Maybe done this close to retirement.
Yeah.
So I think thinking of the broader impacts of our work, McKenna, again, aspires to be a faculty member. And by me collaborating with her, I gave her an early publication. And I'm also showing her what faculty members do in a very transparent way. Right. So I think that's what helps me. But if I didn't fully answer your question, you can feel free to re-ask a part of it again.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Long. This is a very great presentation, and I really like your discussion around ethics and also the way you talk about positionality statement. I was just reading what Dr. Bryan was talking because, we kind of writing papers and stuff. We're thinking about how to kind of write our own positionality statement. I think reading yours was a very good way it gave me more way to think about how I can structure my own. So that was also great. And most importantly, I like the way you focus on talk about broader impact. All right. Sometimes emerging scholars. So my question was just about that. The way criteria are set towards what counts to be maybe important or rank for status and stuff like that. But the discussion around, just looking at the impact on your students you graduated, I think that was very motivating. And I would just kind of ask a question about that. Like, what kind of advice do you give to emerging scholars, that student coming out from a doctoral program, going out in the industry, want to become professor and have their work, and still having the kind of insecurity of not being cited among scholars and something like that? What could be your kind of advice to them?
So I'll give a few points of advice to that question. It's a great question, like the others I've answered so far. So I have to be honest, Dr. Strayhorn was a big name in the field. So he was one of my two PhD advisors. I had co-advisors, Dr. Paul Post, who was in technology education at Ohio State, and then Dr. Strayhorn in higher education. And Dr. Strayhorn was a full professor, I think the youngest in university's history, very well known, had a book about sense of belonging. And there was one time in which my most cited paper, Academic and Social Barriers, and I don't think he has a problem with me saying this, I was the leading researcher and author of that publication. But he told us then, and I did wrestle with it a little bit, he said that if you want this work to get cited, I should be first author. And it was his idea as well. The original study design was his idea. I just did most of the labor to bring that forth. And I believe it's been cited more heavily because of that. So sometimes I think we have to link ourselves with more prominent people. I know Trina was recognized by Mary Beth Gassman, who's done a lot of great work with HBCUs, is well known in higher education. And I think Mary Beth's platform increases Trina's platform. Trina getting a career award, for her work, that increases the platform. I didn't get a career award. I applied, but I didn't get it. And so we do have to be strategic as well. So if we can align ourselves with big names, if you can do work with Sean Harper, if you can do work with some of the ASEE fellows, there's a list of those you can find online. If you can get a career award, even winning a small award like I did at a regional conference, those things do help. So I don't want to pretend that, because I don't value those things as much as I value broader impacts, I don't try to protect myself by looking for, documented forms of impact.
So,
Thank you.
So I just wanted to mention really quickly, or Dr. Long, can you talk about the differences between, for our newer students, talk about this whole idea of impact and making a difference in these high impact journal publications, high citations, and how that should be thought about when you're looking at a research one university, a teaching focused university, and the differences that can make in different career options, different career paths. I'm just so that others can hear that.
So another thing I've done strategically, and it was an offer that was first given to me. I didn't seek this out or know about it, but JE, Journal of Engineering Education, is the most prominent in our field. Stephen knows that, Trina knows that, others who are on here. I don't have a journal article published with JE, but I have 2 guest editorials. And so one, I was invited after being on a panel, and I was told that this guest editorial is still going to get potential visibility at the level of a journal article, if not higher, because it's short. It's at the top of a journal article release, meaning a series of journal articles together. And people are going to know who you are now, and then maybe cite and read your other work. And so I'm still, hoping at some point that I'll get a publication. But to be honest with you, the Journal of Negro Education publication means way more to me than anything in the Journal of Engineering Education. And that's because I need to be critical that a lot of the, editors, associate editors, people who publish there, they don't look like me. They don't represent the perspective I represent. And so there is an inherent bias there. And being at a teaching institution, I don't have graduate students helping me do this work. I don't have postdocs helping me do this work. So I am at a disadvantage. My institutional name is not well known like a Virginia Tech or a Purdue or even a FIU. We're not, a research one institution. And so those things, certainly come into play. And again, you have to find ways to get exposure, whether that, some people want to be an associate editor because they'll learn how to get their work submitted and accepted, or to potentially become an editor and have that position of power. Others may do things like what I did with the guest editorial, right? Or you might present at conferences that are more open to your work. So I know for the sports and STEM work that I did, I presented at one on race that specific to Black people and, the populations I wanted to serve. So you just have to find venues that are more accepting, whether that's a regional conference, whether that's, a race-based conference, whether that's a specific division, whether a specific type of submission or publication, like the guest editorial versus a full journal article. But I'm still working towards these things. I have not figured out a full strategy to overcome them. Those are the few ways that I've gone about it. I even got funding for one grant from the NCAA. So rather than just thinking NSF is going to see the potential and benefits of doing work with student athletes, so I've sought funding from other institutions. But that's the way I've been able to maneuver and make a difference so far. Certainly open to other suggestions if someone else on the call wants to say something else.
But thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate the time today.